Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. It is May 1927, and we meet a man pretending to be a priest. But would a priest really use nitroglycerin to blow up a prison? Plus, we hook back up with Wild West desperado Matt Kimes. In his hometown, is he meeting old friends or maybe visiting family? No. Now, he's hitting banks he already stole from and, of course, shooting and killing people. May 1927's Decades of Heistery's main stories video may be the most murderous and villain-filled episode to date. The Evening Star from May 12, 1927 struck out with a crazy title, Lifer Recaptured in Garb of Priest. It was subtitled, Mike Evans was trying to help friend escape from state prison. This wild ride takes place in Joliet, Illinois, where we meet William Mike Evans. Evans was an escaped prisoner from Missouri who had been convicted of murder and sentenced to life back in 1919. However, he'd escaped from prison on August 9th of 1923. Well, here's what happened in May of 1927. Evans donned a priest's attire. He went up to the old state prison in Joliet, Illinois. That was located about 2 miles from the new state prison. And he went right up to the prison gates. And this is clearly the good old days because he walked up there and asked to see a prisoner, which apparently was a regular procedure. In this case, Evans asked to see a prisoner named Harry Funk. Luckily, the warden, Elmer Green, had somehow learned about an escape plot, so the guards were ready. All right, so now who is this Harry Funk? He was serving 10 years for the $60,000 robbery of a bank at Chenoa, Illinois. Chenoa. That robbery took place back in April or May of 1926. It seems that Funk had posed as a bank examiner, and then after closing hours, Funk and 2 companions entered the bank and bound and gagged the bank officials, and then took their time scooping up all the cash and negotiable securities. So why would Evans dress as a priest and then try to break Funk out of prison? Well, Harry Funk had been captured at Champaign, Illinois, and the connection between the two became clearer as it was Funk who had helped Evans escape from that Missouri prison at Jefferson City. At the time, Evans had been a trustee and fled the prison while he was on an errand. Well, the New Britain Daily Herald from that same day even wondered if Evans was one of the 2 companions who pulled the Chenoa bank job with Funk. All right, so we go back to the prison front gate. The guards supposedly were struck by, quote, the man's hardened features and unpriestly mien, end quote. And so the guards, quote, pounced upon the imposter, end quote. It took 4 guards to subdue Evans. 1 or more of the guards must have then gone over to Evans' car because he allegedly shouted, quote, be careful, there's soup in the car, end quote. Back in our January 1927 main story video, we explained that a soup man was a bomb expert. That was important during the Osage Reign of Terror story that we covered back then. So when he'd been subdued and shouted the warning, the guards found that Evans had a revolver on him, but in his automobile he had the following: mustard gas and a large amount of nitroglycerin, which constitutes the soup, and also 4 suits of clothing. It appears that Evans was planning on breaking out Funk and 3 other prisoners by blasting the walls down. Now, had he succeeded, a possible mad rush for the opening could have occurred, letting out hundreds of other prisoners. Imprisoned there were 4 convicted murderers forming a bizarre, insane, and vicious quartet. This included Dickie Loeb, Midget Fernekes, Warren Lincoln, and Harold Croarkin. That's Croarkin. Really quickly, Loeb is of Leopold and Loeb infamy. They were known for the kidnapping and murder of a teenager to prove that they were so intelligent that they could commit the perfect crime. That was what became known as the crime of the century. Fernekes, aka the Midget Bandit, was actually about 5'3", but was in fact a cold-blooded killer who robbed people, who robbed banks, who killed casually. Once he attempted to blow his way out of a jail using dynamite. He'd been involved in a $1 million kidnapping plot and more. And he was even thought by some to have been involved in the Chenoa, Illinois bank heist with Funk and Evans. Now, Warren Lincoln, the third convicted murderer there, is probably less familiar, but no less of an unusual and sick character. A lawyer, a florist, Lincoln pleaded guilty by virtue of insanity for the murder of his wife and her brother. What probably exacerbated things was that he burned their headless bodies and apparently sealed their heads in concrete blocks. And the fourth, Harold Croarkin, was then only 26. Croarkin, known as the Goof throughout his youth, was said to have listlessly announced, quote, "gosh," end quote, after hearing his sentence of life for the murder of a 6-year-old boy with a blacksmithing hammer. Links on all 4 of them are included in the description. When questioned, Evans admitted to having 3 friends at the prison aside from Funk, but did not name them. When asked about the nitroglycerin, he replied, quote, "It might have been necessary to blow a chunk out of the prison," end quote. Well, the New Britain Daily Herald from the next day, May 13, 1927, added the story, 2 women identify Evans as Bank Bandit. It appeared that Evans was indeed not only a member of the crew that hit the Chenoa, Illinois bank, but its robbery crew leader. That's at least according to the 2 women witnesses. And magically, the amount stolen had gone from a $60,000 heist to a $100,000 heist, while Evans refused to answer their accusations. Though it does appear that he talked to some degree, because as we move forward to the 21st of May, we see the Evening Star's Battle in Street follows efforts of Bloomington, Illinois sheriffs to seize jeweler indicted in bank holdup. Note, it did not say jewelry thief, but jeweler. So here's what happened. 3 sheriffs from Bloomington, Illinois arrived in Chicago, quote, with shiny pistols and a capias, end quote, for David Blumenfield. Capias is an arrest warrant that allows authorities to hold the person to ensure he'll appear in court. So now this wild ride is about to get wilder. A passerby saw the local neighborhood jeweler, Blumenfield, facing gunmen with pistols. People began to gather until hundreds of them formed a mob and then swarmed Blumenfield's jewelry store because they thought a holdup was occurring. The crowd grew as they appeared to rush the store to take down the gunman to save the jeweler. Well, fortunately, someone made a call to Chicago police who, quote, came galloping to the scene, end quote. Now, adding to the mayhem, Mrs. Blumenfield and another unnamed woman had, quote, singled out one of the deputies and were keeping him busy defending himself from flying fingers, end quote. The mob was entirely mistaken, as this was not a jewelry store heist, but an arrest. Perhaps that group would not have formed into a potentially violent mob had they known that Blumenfield had been arrested a week previous for his possible connection with the now $184,000 bank robbery at Chenoa, Illinois. Blumenfield had been freed under bond pending a habeas corpus hearing. Meanwhile, he'd been indicted at Bloomington for the Chenoa robbery. Chicago police delayed things, which is why the Bloomington sheriffs decided to acquire that capias and ended up going directly to Chicago to physically retrieve Blumenfield. Apparently, there was some quirk to serving a capias in that it had to be served in a public setting, and it's possible that it needed to be done along a public road. Well, they tried to arrest Blumenfield in the street in front of his store, but Blumenfield believed he could retreat inside his store and be protected by that previous habeas corpus writ. The battle of the writs would play out in court, so we will need to follow up on Evans and Blumenfield as more details become available. That's a crazy one, right? Well, you gotta love the Brownsville Herald. The May 18, 1927 front page had a story about a girl being bitten by a rattlesnake, but saved by her sister's quick actions, and a story about the, quote, demented farmer, end quote, from Michigan who blew up a school, killing 35 children and possibly 9 adults. Our focus, however, is on bandits loot 2 banks in Oklahoma town, slay Marshall. So we head to the Tulsa, Oklahoma area, where we see simultaneous bank heists and at least 1 dead, which means a date with Matt Kimes and company yet again. Here are the facts. The Farmers National Bank and the First National Bank of Beggs, Oklahoma were hit once again. Marshall W.J. McAnally was shot and killed. He'll be added to the Memorial Honor Roll for 1927. Tulsa authorities were notified, quote, over long-distance telephone shortly before noon, end quote, by citizens from Beggs. One of the robbers recognized was indeed Matthew Kimes, quote, notorious Oklahoma desperado, end quote. A Mrs. Campbell was shot in the head by one of the robbers during what sounds like a gunfight between citizens and police versus the crooks, and she was at the time expected to die. So Marshall McAnally opened fire on 5 of the 9 bandits as they exited the Farmers Bank with the loot. 2 shots struck McAnally, while Mrs. Campbell, standing across the street with a child in her arms, was struck by 1 or more bullets and fell unconscious. The child appeared to not have been hit or injured in the shooting or the fall. The total taken from both banks was around $4,000. For that, 30 to 40 shots were fired. Well, Kimes had been one of the participants in the Farmers National Bank robbery in Beggs, Oklahoma, last spring, in which $20,000 was taken. The Daily Alaska Empire condensed the story, may have corrected some mistakes made by the Herald, and presented a great title. 9 robbers loot 2 banks. It was subtitled Wild West Robbery Pulled Off in Oklahoma. Desperado Recognized. The story ran right next to President Silent on 3rd term. It was Silent Calvin Coolidge, after all, and this was back in the days of presidents being able to run for unlimited terms. Well, the Douglas Daily Dispatch ran a story the next day titled Notorious Outlaw and Band Loot 2 Banks in Oklahoma. So nothing special there, though they did add that the total had now gone from $4,000 to $18,000. This article confirmed that employees from both banks recognized the leader as Kimes, a, quote, will-o'-the-wisp young desperado whose sensational exploits have been a modern parallel of the careers of Jesse James and Al Jennings, end quote. I would imagine if Kimes heard about that line and was literate, that he would have gotten a copy of the paper and clipped that line as a memento. According to the Douglas Daily Dispatch, that 9-member crew actually used 3 motor cars with 3 robbers per vehicle. So the cars entered town and 1 car went to each of the 3 banks in town. Members from 2 cars then got out of their vehicles and entered the First National and Farmers banks and yelled, quote, "Throw up your hands," end quote. As the robbers searched for money, Mrs. Charles Campbell, who had been shopping, left her kids in the car and ran into a pool room to alert the people in the hall that heists, plural, were taking place. The Douglas Daily Dispatch refers to Marshal McAnally as MC, not WJ, and notes that he faced a hail of bullets, with one striking him in the chest, killing him almost instantly. They noted that Mrs. Campbell was hit shortly after. Well, the gunfire naturally attracted a crowd that poured into the streets, with men gathering up firearms and hopping into cars to pursue the fleeing robbers. That's why only 2 of the 3 banks were hit. Within 1 hour of the start of the chase, one of the crooks' cars had been found abandoned. Where? About 8 miles west of Beggs, Oklahoma, on a ranch where Kimes spent his boyhood. Compelling circumstantial evidence. Finally, the Seward Daily Gateway ran a well-written aggregation of the details that we already know. 2 banks robbed, $18,000 taken by youthful bandit. Subtitled, "Gang Escapes with Second Bankroll from His Hometown." Since they didn't add any other details to add to our understanding, and this is an ongoing story, we will continue our pursuit of Matt Kimes as more information becomes available in future follow-up episodes. Pretend priests, kid killers, and Wild West desperados, and it's only May of 1927. We're still 2 years from the stock market crash and the Great Depression. For now, we'll move on to June of 1927 and start the summer off with more bank robbery mayhem. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.